Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Lamardo. I am a digital design accessibility manager at CVS Health, and I'm also a Vue.js Community Partner. So today I'm here to talk to you about reusable widgets that work, and I'll be doing this with Vue.js. So let's get started over here. So our agenda today, I'll be covering modals, toggles, accordions, and tabs. Feel free to post any questions you might have on the chat, and I'll answer them towards the end. So kind of getting started, looking at modals. And if we go ahead and take a look at the modal ARIA authoring practices, so I actually have this over here. We can see that this gives us a lot of details about what the modal should look like, what should it behave, and a lot of the technical considerations that we have to keep in mind. And sometimes this can be a little bit overwhelming for some people to read through, especially when you have a lot of other widgets to consider. So I've broken this down to a more consumable piece. So here we have the design consideration for modals. So we want to make sure that all your modals have a button that closes the dialog. We also want to make sure that you're obscuring the content outside of this dialog with some visual styling. So sometimes you'll see that grayed out background. And that grayed out background also should prevent users from interacting with any content outside of the dialog. So for example, if you have a modal dialog open, you shouldn't be able to interact with elements that are behind that modal or even tab to those. So not only for mouse, but also you have to keep in mind keyboard is also prevented from accessing those that content. And there's also a couple of things that they mention in the guidelines. So they also talk about how focus should be handled. So there's a couple of things to watch out here. When a modal opens, focus could be set to a couple of different places. Number one, the most preferable is for it to be moved into the first focusable element inside the dialog. Then if that's not available, like if there's no focusable element, or if it makes more sense to, you should move it to any static element on top of the dialog. And this will ensure that your content is easy to read and that nothing is out of view. Like for example, let's say that your first focusable element is scroll down and kind of take some content out of view. If you do that, then users might lose some of that content. So you want to make sure that all of the content remains in view. You also want to make sure that you're moving focus into something that is not a destructive action. So for example, let's say that this modal is to like delete a bank account and it opens and it's like, are you sure you want to delete this bank account? Your focus shouldn't be on the confirm button right away because users might mistakenly press it and then delete their bank account and there might not be a way to retrieve it. Also, you might also want to move focus into the most used element. For example, if the button is just continue, if it's just like an informational dialogue, then that makes sense also. Then let's talk a little bit about what are the interactions that we should expect for when the modal closes. So when you close the dialog, we want to make sure that the focus moves back to the element that opened the dialog. Or if that's no longer available, then we want to make sure that the element, that the focus moves to an element that has a logical workflow. So maybe the next step in that process. Or if reopening that dialog is not really common. So you might want to move it to another element. Now, looking at the keyboard interactions that are expected, we expect tab to move focus to the next tabbable element inside the modal. And if you're on the last element, it should loop you around to the first element. And if you press Shift Tab, it should move you to the previous tabbable element, and it should loop you around the modal as well. So this ensures that you're not accessing any of the content that's behind that modal with your keyboard as well. And we also want to make sure that your escape key will close off that dialog. So let's take a look at some of the technical considerations that they list. So I'm going to go back to the site. And these can be found. So we've talked about keyboard interactions and some of the details there. And these technical considerations are going to be found in this section here. And these are the why ARIA rules, states, and properties on the why practices. So the dialog container must have a role of dialogue for that container. Then it must also, so you could see that here, role of dialogue. On the right, you could see some of the code. Then we also want ARIA modal equals true. And this will ensure that some assistive technology will be prevented from going kind of behind that modal, or outside that modal, I should say. Then we also want to make sure that we have an ARIA labeled by or ARIA label if an ARIA labeled by is not feasible. And then this should refer to the title of the dialogue. And of course, if the content that's inside of the dialogue can provide a description, then you could also set the role of dialogue to have an ARIA described by and pair it to that description. And all elements that are required to operate the dialogue should be descendants of this container that has the role of dialogue. So let's take a look at some examples. So here, in the modal dialogue example, so this is what it looks like. This is what a modal should behave. So I'm going to tab to it, and I actually have this very helpful indicator for where my focus is. So it's going to be green for me. So I'm going to tap to it. I'm going to enter, and you could see that this opens up a modal. And right now I have it set to focus on the outer div, and then I can tab through, and you could see that I cannot move to content behind that modal. And if I shift tab, you could see that it kind of moves backwards. And again, my focus is not allowing me to get to the content outside of that. And if I press escape key, it closes that dialog and my focus returns to the button that opened it. So let's take a look at the code for this. So I'm using Vue for this. And what I've done is I've set the modal here. And then it will only display if the modal is open. And actually, let me open up the home page. Yeah, so this one, examples. So you could see here that the modal is this component here, and it's actually opened through this button, and it's toggled with this function here. And once that is true, then the modal will display. So when this modal displays, we can see that we have the role of dialogue that we've called out, the ARIA modal. We've also added this ARIA labeled by that calls back to the heading. One thing that I want to note is inside Vue, because this is kind of moving from one component to another, we cannot call focus into a ref that's in another component. So in order for focus to work inside a new component, I've actually created a directive for Vue focus. So for vFocus. So if you go down to directives, you can see that this directives will look for, as soon as this element is mounted, then it's going to focus on that element specifically. So as soon as this component is mounted on the page, then it's going to focus on this outer div here that I've selected. And then another thing that is a little bit different for this modal is that right now, in order to keep the focus trapped inside that modal, we're also I've also added these focus guards. So what these will do is when you're on the first element on the page and you tap back, so it's going to, it's actually going to be invisible, but it's going to touch this div, and then this is going to call this method, which is going to move the focus to the last element on the page. And then we have a very similar function that will do the same for when you're on the last element on the page, and then you hit that focus guard and it's going to go to the first element on the page. So this is one way of handling that focus, that kind of like that focus trap. And again, I've created an event handler, an event listener for the escape down key. And whenever that key is called, then we're going to close the modal. Okay. Now moving into how we can create this to be reusable. Well, there's actually a couple of things that I did here. So if we look at this other example here. So we have reusable components, and let me open this on the page so you all see where I'm looking at. So all of these examples, I have them both in CodePen, so you can look at that. But I also hosted them on this page, on this link, which you also have right here. So on this page, you can see that we have the examples that are not the reusable widgets, and then these are in the reusable widgets. So you can see that they pretty much behave the exact same. And then you can see that this has a little bit of different content. So let's take a look at how that happened. So again, the exact same functionality as we've seen before, but this time we're importing this component. So we just imported the same way that we did before. And then we're passing this template with a V slot for header. That way we are very specific about where that header should live inside of our reusable component. And then the same will happen for the button, because the button does have to be the last element on the page, on the modal. That way the focus strap will function correctly. So if we look at the dialog widget, and this one is the reusable one, we can see that everything looks the same. So we have that role of dialogue, ARIA modal, focus, indicator, and then this is kind of where things change a little bit. And then here I have this slot name for the header. So I have this fallback for title if there's not one available. And then here is where the rest of the content is going to be coming in. And then of course I've allowed this slot to be for the last button. That way I can keep the functionality that I've created on the outside for this. So then anytime that I want to create another modal, all I have to do is reuse this widget, add a title, add whatever content I want, and then provide a last actionable item for that button. And you can see that I've actually pulled in all of the modal data from my data down here. So this is where I'm kind of building all of the reusable components. So if you want, you could build different modals by just providing this content and then adding it to that reusable component. Okay. So moving into toggle buttons. So let's take a look at the documentation for toggle buttons. And actually, it's not called out like this, but it is inside of a button. So you can see here that a button can have multiple different types. So you can see that a button is a widget that enables it to trigger an action or an event. And then through ARIA, we can actually support 2 additional types. So we can have toggle buttons, which I'll be talking about today, or menu buttons. So toggle buttons have some design considerations. So first, it has 2 states. So it can either be turned on or off, meaning that it can be pressed or not pressed. And you want to be able to tell assistive technologies about that toggle with the ARIA pressed attribute. So we also want to make sure that as you're changing this attribute, so you toggle it from true and false, you're not also changing any visible label that is on that button. So you're either changing the ARIA press attribute or you're changing the label. You don't want to do both. So let's talk a little bit about how we want to handle the focus for toggle buttons. So there's 4 different ways that you can go about this. Number 1, if you're activating the buttons, if activating this toggle button does not dismiss the current context, then the focus should remain inside the button. If this button then opens or closes a modal dialog, then you should follow those standards for how focus is handled for a modal dialog. If the button indicates a context change, then the focus should move to the starting point of that action. If the focus is activated with a shortcut key, then the focus should remain in the context from which the shortcut key was activated. And then the keyboard functionality for this is actually pretty simple. We want to make sure that both enter and space key activate that button. And since it is a button, this is semantically, there's nothing else that I need to add here. And here are the technical considerations for this. So we want to make sure that it has a role of button. We want to make sure that the button has an accessible name, that if there is a description available, that we're adding it with ARIA described by. And if the button action is unavailable, we could also set that to ARIA disabled. And since we are using a toggle button, we want to make sure that we're adding an ARIA press state. So you could see that on the example on the right, I have a button with ARIA pressed false, and then I have a mute button. So let's take a look at some of the examples. So here I have two types of toggles, right? So I'm going to go through, and then I have a mute. So if I press it, then you could see that it kind of changes it. And in fact, I'm going to do it on this one. It has better icons. So you could see that I was able to toggle it. And if I inspected, and let me just zoom this in. But if I inspect this element, then we could see that as I press it, then the ARIA pressed on the right here it's kind of switching back from true to false, and that's what we want to see. And you can also see, and I'm in Chrome, in the Chrome DevTools, and I'm inside the accessibility tab. Then you could see that inside the computer properties, the name for this element is still mute. So even if I'm toggling it on, and you could see the ARIA pressed inside the ARIA attributes it's switching, you could see that the accessible name for this element remains the same. So that's what we want to see. And then the same thing for this one. So this is if I have a password field and I want to toggle the disability, we can also do it with a toggle button. And you can see that if I inspect this button, and I'm going to just keep looking at the accessibility tab for the accessibility tree, the computer properties, and the ARIA attributes, you could see that it kind of behaves similarly. Ooh, let me just move into the button. But you can see that it behaves similarly, where the label remains the same, and then the ARIA attribute changes. Okay, so let's take a look at the code for how this happened. So if we're looking at toggle, and I'm going to stay in the mute button, this one's pretty straightforward. So we have this mute that toggles on, and then the only thing that really changes here is also the image. So we've actually, we can bind the source, and then if it's muted, then we can change the icon with it as well. So even though the label might not change, we can change the icon, and it is a hidden icon, so it's not going to kind of announce that difference. And then when ARIA pressed, it is binded to the value of muted. So when that toggles on and off, then that should update. So this one's pretty straightforward. And then looking at this from a reusable component standpoint, so let me open that up. You can see that this one's pretty similar. Nothing much changed. The only thing I've done is I added a slot for any content that could be added. So like if somebody wants to add a word, they can do that. And then I've actually made it so that you can pass through any props for any icons that are needed. So if I take a look at the reusable components one, you can see that in my toggle button, I've actually included the text for that toggle, and then I've pushed in the toggle icons that I have on this component. So the icons don't live inside the reusable component, but the component that is using it. So if I'm going to scroll down here to the data, we can see that my toggle has that text that I'm pulling in and both icons that I've actually have in my assets. So if you're pulling it from your assets, you do need that require. If not, you could use the string form for a link. So again, whenever you want to reuse any toggles, you could just do it like this, provide icons if you want, and provide text if you want. Okay, so moving on to accordions. So let's take a look at the documentation for accordions. Okay, so this one seems pretty straightforward. We have some functionality. We have some of the accordions and what they include. Again, they give some examples, keyboard interaction, and the technical considerations. So let's take a look at how I've shorthanded that. So the design considerations for accordions. Well, accordions are a vertically stacked set of interactive headings that contain a title, code, content snippet, or thumbnail representing a section of content. So an accordion must include an accordion header and an accordion panel. The header is going to kind of be function as the label for the thumbnail, and then the accordion panel is going to hold all of the content of that section. So let's take a look at the keyboard interaction for this. There's actually quite a bit, but as you can see from this table, a lot of it is optional. So some of the things that we must have are that the enter or space key can either expand the associated collapsed panel. So if I am on an accordion and I have focused on it and I press enter or space, that should expand the panel so I could see the content that is corresponding to that accordion. And if the implementation allows, if I click on it again, it should be able to collapse that content. If you hit tab, then you should move to the next focusable element. And if you hit shift tab, then you should move to the previous focusable element. So you could move through all of the accordions. And then all of the remaining ones are optionals. So you could have down arrow key, which can move focus from the accordion header to the next accordion header, and optionally looping back through the headers if you're on the last one. And the same thing for the up arrow key. So you're moving up from the accordion headers. And if you're on the first one, then you're going to loop back down. And then the home and end keys are also optionals. And the home button can take you to the first accordion. And then the end button can take you to the last accordion. So let's take a look at some of the technical considerations for this. So each accordion is a header, right? So they are wrapped in a heading. Then it also has ARIA controls, which has the set, which is paired to the corresponding accordion panel. So you can see here on the example here, we have accordion 1, and it has ARIA controls for section 1. And then you could see that there is a region that has an ID of section 1 that has that content for the first accordion. So then we could just set that ARIA control to that ID and then pair that. And then we also want to make sure that if it is not, collapsing is not permitted, that we are adding ARIA disabled. And optionally, we can have ARIA labeled by for each panel content that corresponds to the header. So for example, in this content here, I have ARIA labeled by accordion 1 ID, which corresponds to the ID of that button header that opens that panel. One call out here, because these the content panels have a role of region, we want to make sure that we're not adding an ARIA labeled by if we have too many, because that will actually add way too many landmarks. So let's take a look at some of the examples here. So let's look at an accordion. So here's an example of the accordion. So if I'm tabbing through, you can see that I can toggle them with my space or enter. And you can see that I'm actually able to expand all of them at once. There is another way to do this where as you're opening one accordion, all of the rest of the accordions will collapse. So let's take a look at how this was built. So looking at the accordion, so this is not the reusable component, this is just the accordion. Let's take a look at what we have here. So we have a heading, then we have the ARIA expanded, which can be true or false, and I'm bringing that in from my data. Then I'm also pairing the ARIA controls, and since I'm looping through these, I'm just giving the ARIA control the value of the index and the content, and then that's going to also be the same for when I loop through all of the content for the for the region of that panel. Okay, and then you can see that when I click here, then I have an update accordion. So let's go ahead and look at that function. So I'm actually checking for multiple. So by these, I mean that are we allowing multiple accordions to be opened at once? If so, then we're just going to toggle that function that expanded. Else, if we're only allowing for one toggle at a time, then we want to make sure that we are collapsing all of them and then setting that one to true. Or closing all of them, right? Okay. So, and then on top of that, I've also added these icons so that we toggle. So like when it's open, then we have that little minus sign. And when it's collapsed, then we have that plus sign that kind of gives that visual indication that we can expand it. So let's take a look at how this would function as a reusable component. So I've actually left it pretty much the same. And let me actually show you how those are used. So in the example, so the first one that I just showed you now, this is how I used it. And in the reusable components, what I have done is, so I just imported the accordions widget, and I've actually just passed in my accordions. And my accordion data structure looks somehow like this. So it has an ID. I'm also calling out whether this specific accordion is expanded. We have the heading, the content, and then I've also added a multiple. So that's that last param that I'm passing, so that if we allow for multiple accordions to be open at once, then this data will tell me. So, and you can see that I am just passing this through as a prop. So let's go to the accordion widget. And this is the reusable one. So let me go down really quick to the props because the tops looks pretty similar. So what I'm doing here is I'm bringing this in as props, and then I am also kind of creating a copy of these as updated accordions. And this is because I cannot mutate the accordions as they come in. So to handle the keyboard functionality and the focus state, I do need to mutate this. But because this is a prop, I'm actually going to just mutate the computed data. And since this is not a change that I need to really keep track of, it's just kind of visual as it happens, then it's okay that I'm not emitting that functionality up to the parent. And then you can see that I'm just doing all of this with the updated accordions. And I'm actually, instead of looping to the accordions that I pulled in with the prop, I'm actually just also looping through all of the updated accordions inside of this reusable components. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Oop, looks like this went down. Okay, so these are the accordions. And in fact, let me set it. Let me actually run this live and then make some changes. npm run serve. Okay, yeah, because I do want to show you what happens when I have reusable components. And I'm actually have to make that change here. So if I have accordions that call this in and they're all not allowing that multiple, then this is what's going to happen. So reusable components. So you could see that as I open one, the rest will collapse. And the same will happen with my keyboard. Now let's take a look at what happens if I set all of these to true. So if multiple is allowed, then I'm able to open all of them and none of them will collapse as I try to expand the next one. Now let's take a look at tabs. Oops. So let's take a look at the documentation for tabs. So again, it's pretty similar to the other ones. They give you the design considerations, they provide examples, they provide the keyboard functionality, and the technical considerations at the bottom. So this is kind of how I've narrowed it down. So tabs are a layer of sections of contents known as tab panels that display one panel of content at a time. So there are three pieces of this. We have a tab list, which contain kind of the set of all of the tab elements. Then we also have the tab element, which acts as the label for the corresponding panel. So these are like the titles. And then the tab panel is the element that holds all of the content that is associated with that tab. Now, there are two types of implementation for this. You can have automatic accordions in which tabs in which, as you kind of go through the tabs, the content will load and open for that tab panel, or you could have it so that you can manually activate those tabs. The recommendation is to have the tabs automatically activate as long as it doesn't cause noticeable latency. So if that content is easy to load and it's quick, or maybe you have preloaded it, then definitely allow your tabs to activate automatically. And then here is the keyboard interaction for these. So tabbing into the tabs will place the focus into the active tab. And then you're actually going to navigate through your tabs using your arrow keys. So if you have horizontal tabs, you're going to navigate with your left and right arrow keys. So your right arrow key is going to move focus to the next tab, where your left arrow key is going to move focus to the previous tab. And if you have vertical tabs, the up arrow is going to go to the previous tab, and the down arrow is going to go to the next tab. And if you have the manually activated tabs, then you're going to have to press space or enter to expand those, to show that content. So this is where the space and enter can activate tab if it's not automatically happening on focus. Also, if there is an associated pop-up menu, then this should open with Shift F10 when focus is on that specific tab. And all of these are optional keyboard interactions for tabs. So you could have home, which moves focus to the first tabs, which optionally, depending on your implementation, should automatically activate it. Then the end key should move focus to the last tab, which again, depending on your implementation, should automatically activate it. And another optional keyboard functionality is the delete key, which if it is allowed, then it will close the current tab and its associated tab panel. Okay, so looking at the technical considerations for this, and I know that this one is, the code on the right is a little bit small, but I'll move to VS Code in a second. So the role of tab list will hold a set of tabs, and it should have an ARIA labeled by or ARIA label if an ARIA labeled by is not possible. So we could see here on the right, I have this div that has a role of tab list, and it has an ARIA label of tabs example, and then it holds all of the tabs that are available. So these buttons that I have here, they have a role of tab. And then the rules for that is that it should have the ARIA controls that matches the content for the panel. Then it should also have ARIA selected set to true if it's selected and active. And it should have ARIA has pop-up if they have a menu available. Then moving down to the panels, so the element that hold the content for each of those tabs. So these should have a role of tab panel. They should also have an ARIA labeled by that is paired to the associated tab, or and set ARIA orientation to either vertical or horizontal. And if you're doing horizontal, that's the default value for this. So let's take a look at some examples. So here is this example of the tabs. So right now my focus is on the first tab, and the first tab is activated. In fact, let me zoom in. And if I use my arrow keys, you could see that I'm now moving through them. And if I'm at the last one and I press my arrow key again, it's going to loop me to the first one. The same thing will happen if I'm moving toward with the left arrow key. So I'm on tab 1, now tab 3, tab 2, tab 1, tab 3, tab 2, tab 1. And you can see that the corresponding content is loading depending on which tab is active. Now, this, let me show you what this looks like for just a regular component. So again, we have this div that is holding all of our tabs that has the role of tab list. And I've just given it an ARIA label of tab list for now because it's just an example. And then inside of there, all of my tabs that have, again, it has that tab title down here. They should all have the role of tab. And then the ARIA selected attribute should depend on whether that is the selected tab or not. Then we also can see that we have the ARIA controls, which will match that tab ID for the panel. And then one thing that I want to call out is that the tab indexing should also change as you kind of update all of these, so that because these are because you only want to focus on them when you're kind of moving your arrow keys or as you tap to the component itself, you want to make sure that you're handling how that's happening. So you can use tab index of -1 to programmatically call focus to those elements. And then I've also made it so that we can update the tab the same with when I press my right and left arrow keys. And again, depending on your implementation, you're going to want to add up and down our keyboard functionality as well. And then we have the tab content here. So it has the role of tab panel and then that corresponding ID. And then I've made it so that I've paired the ARIA label to that tab title. So let's quickly take a look at how this was implemented with the tabs. This is pretty similar to the one that I showed for the accordions. And if we look at, not the examples, but the reusable one, if I look at, and you could kind of see the difference between the accordions and the tabs, all I've done is kind of the same thing. I'm just passing those tabs through, and this is what my tabs look like. So my tabs will have an ID, whether it is selected or not. So only one of them should be selected at a time. Then we have that title and the content. So if I wanted to create more tabs, if I wanted to add 15 tabs, I just have to keep creating objects here, and then that should dynamically update. So if you could see here, we have this tab widgets, and if we go down, you can see that I've done the same thing where I'm pulling in the prop, using the computer property of updated tabs to actually change and handle the updated tabs. And then I'm actually looping through that updated prop. I mean, the updated computer property that is pulling in that prop data. And again, we don't really want to keep track of these changes like application-wide, so it's okay if we just kind of toss that on render. Okay, so that's all I had for you all today. So here are some resources that you can take a look at. We have some of the ARIA practices. We also have the web content accessibility guidelines and the GitHub repo for this code. I've also provided links to all of the code pens for this. If anybody wants to play around with that, that's also available. Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
All right. Nice work, Maria. We do have a handful of questions for you here. So this one is from Jimmy. He asks, when doing training at a previous job, they emphasized that the close button should be focused first, if possible, to allow the visitor to reverse the modal action versus having to search for the close button. Is that still considered a good practice?
Yeah, so a lot of people actually prefer doing that. And if that makes sense for your user flow, then that's totally fine. As long as the focus doesn't go to an action item that is hard to revert.
Excellent, thank you. All right, next question from Charles here. For a toggle button, can you explain why not to change both the label and pressed value? For example, the mute button would ideally change its label from mute to muted to visibly reflect the current state.
Yes. So if you want to change the visible label, that is fine, but I wouldn't change the pressed state as well. So let's take a look at how that would work, right? So let's say that I have a button that says mute, and then I have ARIA pressed false because it's not on mute, right? And then I press it, and then the mute pressed attribute changes to true. So I'm listening in and I'm saying like, okay, so I have mute pressed, that is true. So I know that it is muted. If I have unmuted pressed to true, I feel like it's kind of like a double, or like if you have unmuted, yeah, hold on. If you have unmute to true, unmute pressed, it's kind of like that double negative. And then that if you have it on mute, so mute to false, then I feel like it's going to cause some confusion for the user. So just do one or the other, not to cause any confusion. That would be my recommendation.
Right, that makes sense. Awesome. Okay, next one. I couldn't find any unit tests for these widget examples in your repo. What kind of accessibility test library do you prefer to use for implementing unit test and checking Vue components? How do you usually test your components?
I was waiting for someone to bring up that I didn't write tests for these. I would normally write tests. I did not have time to write tests, but absolutely, if you're writing any code, always write tests, especially if you're using reusable components as you try to add more functionality or new things into those components. They're likely to break, and then they're likely to break and you not notice that it's broken. Especially when we're working with accessibility, we want to make sure that all the things that we've added in there remain functional. As far as what testing libraries I've used, I really liked using Cypress with my old team to do some of the end-to-end testings, as well as Jest for some of the unit tests. I know that it doesn't cover all of the accessibility things that we would like to test for, but it does cover some, at least some of the basic things that we could kind of grab.
Great. Sophie asks, what's the difference between the examples and the reusable widgets?
Oh, yeah. So I wrote them differently because the examples are kind of, yes, they're reusable components, but they are not, you still have to go in and edit the data inside those examples, where the reusable components and the reusable widgets are these pieces of components that you can kind of, inside this other component, feed it all of the information that you possibly need and not have to go into that component to edit anything. So it is just like easier to reuse than the examples that I first showed. The reason why I kind of kept them separately is because when you get to the reusability of it, it kind of loses the semantics and the cleanliness of like just being able to read through that code and understand what is happening there. So I wanted to give people the option to read it kind of clean. And then if you wanted to get into the reusable component, then you can get and read it there.
Super, thank you. Okay, next up, I'm going to do my best to make sure I'm reading this well to you. Okay, our modals are injected as a child of body. When we open the modal, is it a good idea to add ARIA hidden equals true on all other elements and then remove that attribute once the modal is closed?
Yes, that is fine. I would say, depending on your setup, I would try to get your modal in like a global place. Like for example, in Vue, I might, depending on the implementation, I might put the modal in the app, for example. That way, it's kind of like a sibling to the rest of the application. That way, you only have to do that hidden on that one piece of your app. But that is totally fine.
Cool. Okay, next one is, asking, why did you use ARIA hidden equals true on the image rather than just empty alt text?
Well, I wanted to make sure, let me see. I did it in a couple of places, but I also wanted to make sure, especially on the images, let's see, on the images for the toggle buttons, because I was allowing people to import whatever images they wanted. I wanted to make sure that this remained hidden, even if the icons that they kind of push in aren't. That way, it's kind of more consistent. Especially if that, let's say that there is a mute and then the alt text for that icon is on mute or mute, and then we're getting like mute, unmute, true, or like pressed. So then that's like a way more complicated. So just setting all of those to fall to hidden, regardless of what the user decides to kind of put in. Oh, give me one second. I'm gonna run for my charger, but you can. I can hear the next question.
Okay. I was just gonna say, somebody in the chat says that makes a lot of sense actually regarding label and ARIA pressed, the kind of double negative, confusing wording there.
Yeah.
Another person says, yeah. Another person says, great content. I'm so happy I attended.
Well, thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for another question or two. This person asks, is there a reason the HTML native dialog was not used? And I think that was when you were talking about toggle buttons.
The toggle button. Well, I really tried to go to stay closely with what the practice, like the authoring practice, recommends, because I know a lot of people have trouble reading these guidelines, and I wanted to make it break it down in a consumable way, without having to read too much external resources to kind of get this done and functional.
Gotcha. All right, I think this is our last question here. If you choose either up/down or left/right for the tabs navigation, how would a blind user know which set of keys to use?
That's a great question. I would say that is an excellent question. I would say that even just based on some user research, I feel like users are likely to just kind of try, and if nothing happens, they might move to then trying the up and down arrow keys. But I would say for tabs, it is more common to see kind of the horizontal ones.
Awesome. Yeah, just a couple of comments from the chat here. Somebody says support for dialogue looks pretty sparse in most major browsers too. And somebody else says the native dialogue element is not well supported by screen readers yet.
Yeah, that's a good call out. Every time I kind of start testing some stuff, I really like to use can I use, if anybody's familiar with that. It kind of shows you what is really well supported or what isn't supported. So for example, are you pressed? So then this will be, any other questions?
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I see one in the chat. Is it bad practice to bind both sets?
To bind both sets.
So I think that might have been in reply to the up, down, left, right question.
I'm not sure what they mean by this. Like, do you mean if you mean like if you have a horizontal tab, but then you're still doing up and right arrow key, I would advise against it, because the up and right arrow key does have functionality inside a page where like it can help you scroll. So I wouldn't mess with it unless it adds, functionality that isn't there for the user.
Great. Okay, well, we are right at time. Maria, thank you so much for your lovely presentation, and thank you so much to our audience for your great questions and engagement tonight.
Thank you so much.